Welcome to Libeth. I'm glad you're here. This week we are in late Heian, Japan, with the Heike Monogatari, written by an anonymous collective of reciters. Authority in the world of the Heike struggles to answer a single practical question. What counts for legitimate rule when sacred ancestry can be invoked, but armies actually hold the ground? The tale insists that legitimacy comes from two uneasy sources at once: proximity to the imperial line and the capacity to make power stick through force. That dual standard never sits easily. The imperial family supplies a ritual aura. The court offers titles that still command deference in form. Yet neither of them by themselves guarantees the means to collect rice, to raise men, to hold a road or a port. The Heike uses the image of the jin bells, the sound that opens the tale and reminds listeners that all things pass, to insist that symbolic authority can vanish as quickly as mist. At the same time, the story shows how men sought to bind that mist to earth by marrying into imperial households, purchasing ranks, and sitting at court while keeping their hands on the sword. That attempt to anchor a ritual center with military muscle defines legitimacy in practice, but it also creates an unstable hybrid that carries the conditions of its undoing forward from the moment of its creation. When formal institutions remain in place, while their real capacities slip, the appearance of order hides a different topology of power beneath it. The ritsuryō system, the legal and administrative language of ancient court rule, still frames the offices, titles, and ceremonies of Kyoto. The Heike continually records those forms: robes, seals, promotions, the movement of posts, and the reading of edicts. But the mountain behind the curtain is now different. Provincial fields no longer answer to a central harvest register so much as to local managers, estate holders, and armed men who enforce extraction. The tale presents an administrative shell that is elegantly intact, while its bones have been replaced. That mismatch matters because ritual authority depends on the perception of efficacy. When court titles no longer reach the countryside, and when taxes are raised by men who wear swords and claim office in the name of the court, the system becomes brittle. The narrative voice of the Heike makes that brittleness visible by returning to scenes in which court ritual and street-level compulsion collide. A minister's decree means little if a warrior controls the road through which grain must pass. And every time the story lingers on such a gap, it sharpens the sense that the formal order cannot long contain the practical reality pressing from below. The hybrid model of power produces a political fact that looks like success at first and like provocation a moment later. When a warrior clan translates battlefield triumph into court rank, it gains both the ceremonial seal and the muscle that enforces order. But in doing so, it also breaks the distance that once protected the imperial center. The Heike shows men who are courtiers in court garb and warriors outside it. And this double identity generates resentment within the old aristocracy, which understands the court as its exclusive space and sees military assent as an encroachment. The tale repeatedly dramatizes the friction between those who insist on precedence and those who claim force, a retired ruler operating in the shadows and a newly elevated commander standing in the light. And this tension gives rise to factionalism. Factions crystallize because the rules that used to order honor and promotion no longer function reliably. The distribution of rank becomes a battlefield of its own. As that fight over honor escalates, it produces alliances of convenience, grudges that fester, and a politics that depends more on the readiness to act than on the grace of ceremonial privilege. That readiness to act is precisely the source of the new social grammar. Authority shifts from inherited office to embodied capacity. The Heike presents warriors not as mere instruments, but as holders of a new type of social capital. The ability to mobilize men, to secure harvests, to judge disputes by force if the court refuses. As they step into roles once reserved for civil administrators, warriors create alternative circuits of loyalty tied to household and lineage, rather than to impersonal imperial command. The narrative dwells on interactions where a province is kept in order by a house whose bonds run through kin and clients rather than through court edicts. And such arrangements do not translate neatly into the code of ranks in Kyoto. That disjunction encourages a political elasticity. Warriors can bend the old system to favor patronage and plunder, and they can turn local justice into a resource for raising soldiers. As the Heike tracks this shift, it reveals a structural instability. When power relies on personal bonds and the extraction of resources rather than on routinized bureaucracy, it becomes faster to build and easier to shatter. And the very velocity that allows a house to rise also prepares conditions in which rivals can unmake it. Economic structures amplify those political stresses by fracturing the state's fiscal base from the inside. The Heike repeatedly points to land and rice as the real currency of power. Large private estates, shōen, pass into the hands of aristocrats and temple complexes, and these estates evade the central tax register. A central court that relies on theoretical entitlement to revenue, but cannot collect it finds itself impoverished in practice. It survives by converting ritual prestige into favors and posts, and those favors become the means by which warrior families buy allegiance. The tale traces how a clan that consolidates control over estate rights and local office can convert that control into a war economy, extracting labor and levies from peasant communities. That conversion creates an economy oriented towards supply for war rather than towards stable administration, which feeds back into the politics. Scarcity encourages predation, and predation sharpens the appetites for military retention rather than for civil governance. The Heike does not treat this as incidental. It makes economic fracture part of the narrative logic, showing that when the central purse is empty, the center loses its ability to mediate conflicts, and therefore invites substitution by the nearest man with soldiers. Patronage becomes the practical form of governance, where formal taxation fails, and it brings its own instabilities. The tale details how appointments and favors travel as currency. A provincial post becomes a reward, an estate becomes tenure for a loyal follower, marriage becomes currency to secure allies. These practices create overlapping claims. One man may hold the court title for a district, while another holds the effective control of its roads and mills, and both claim legitimacy. The Heike frames these entanglements through stories in which appointments breed jealousy, and where the redistribution of resources to one set of clients strips another set of its livelihood. Patronage solves short-term problems. It binds followers together under a leader, but it also produces a policed economy of dependency. That economy collapses if the leader's capacity weakens, or if rivals cut off essential channels. The tale shows how the concentration of patronage into a single house heightens the stakes of every political maneuver, making success and failure more explosive and contagious than they would be in a balanced, institutionalized system. Family and lineage operate inside all of these networks as both glue and fault line. The Heike repeatedly makes marriage into political technique, Women move between households and become living links that stitch clans together. The story follows a woman who becomes the conduit of authority. She is moved from house to house, and in her wrist and in her cradle the public fate of families seems to gather and unravel. That visibility of women as connectors underscores a structural paradox. Lineage claims give a patina of continuity to power, but they remain vulnerable to the contingencies of childbirth, alliance, and death. Because the new social order depends on a few households to bind together military and ritual legitimacy, the chain of succession and the health of marriages become public concerns, not private ones, and thus every domestic strain turns into a political vulnerability. The Heike turns private grief into public consequence to make clear that patriarchy and lineage, which should reproduce authority, often expose it to collapse when marriages fail to secure lasting bonds, or when a single death leaves a patronless following. Social mobility in this world carries both promise and structural hazard. The Heike celebrates rise by merit, by force, and by cunning, but also shows how upward movement changes social expectations and produces backlash. A house that ascends from provincial prominence into the corridors of court power does so without the entrenchment of bureaucratic tradition. It arrives with troops and a claim to distribution that the aristocratic families interpret as usurpation. This mobility does vital work. It renews personnel. It supplies the state with men capable of enforcing order. But because it is not matched by institutional absorption, it generates insecurity. An aristocracy that sees its privileges diluted will use the forms of court etiquette and rumor to work against newcomers, while the successful house depends on consolidation through favors that breed dependency. The Heike dramatizes this tension by lingering on moments when newly elevated families attempt to naturalize their status through visible signs. And those attempts, read as braggadocio, intensify hostility among those who fear losing their inherited standing. Mobility thus fuels ascent, but also amplifies the appetite for a corrective backlash that can coalesce into lethal political opposition. Provincial governance becomes the theater where these stresses play out because the state has, in practice, ceded the everyday tasks of rule to local agents. The Heike highlights how the office of provincial steward has been hollowed of salaried bureaucratic function, and how men in the provinces increasingly rely on force and on local alliances to manage peasant labor and to enforce judicial decisions. This practical devolution produces a centrifugal pull. Each locality becomes a node of semi-autonomy, capable of resisting central commands if those commands threaten local interest. The tale shows rural leaders who cultivate ties with temple complexes and with neighboring houses, creating overlapping jurisdictions that the central court cannot easily penetrate. That multiplicity of sovereignties trenches the land into zones where the state is effectively absent. The more zones like that appear, the more the capital's rituals, its edicts and condemnations, lose purchase. The Heike therefore reads provincialization not as a gradual erosion, but as a structural transformation that recasts the very meaning of political order. Religious institutions enter this field as independent centers of wealth, and at times, as armed bodies that can tip local balances. The tale records monasteries that hold estates, collect rents, and command militias of laymen. Their abbacies become both spiritual and material authorities. Temples offer sanctuary and also levy men. That doubleness means that the religious field is not a mediating neutral, but a competitor for resources and for followers. when a temple claims protection over an estate or uses its influence to sponsor a client into office, it becomes part of the same web of patronage that the court and warrior houses inhabit. The Heike renders several scenes in which temples act with the logic of political actors, raising monks as soldiers, negotiating land rights, pressuring courts, and those scenes reveal how spiritual power can harden into territorial authority. This entanglement complicates any attempt to re-establish a central equilibrium, because a solution that strips temporal power from temples requires both political will and military capacity, and those are precisely the scarce goods that the center lacks. All these structural shifts accumulate into political tensions of a specific kind. A dominant house that secures court rank and military command concentrates resources, but also concentrates enemies. The Heike does not treat dominance as self-sustaining. Rather, it shows dominance as an attractor for grievance. When a single family positions itself at the intersection of imperial favor, court office, and provincial extraction, it draws both admiration and hatred. Rivals cannot easily dislodge such power through routine means, so they resort to coalition building, rumor, and violence. The tale portrays how resentment moves like a contagion. Court nobles deprived of their customary rents and standing join with provincial magnates and disgruntled retainers to form unstable alliances against the central house. Because the house's authority rests on personal bonds rather than on impersonal institutions, those bonds are fragile. A defection or an assassination can unravel alliances overnight. The Heike insists that the very concentration meant to secure a polity becomes the mechanism that unleashes a multidirectional pressure toward fragmentation. The literature of the Heike repeatedly returns to images of impermanence to explain how fortunes reverse, and those images do analytical work rather than moralizing ones. The opening evocation of the Genbels, translated for listeners as the sound that echoes the impermanence of all things, that the flourishing of the world is but a dream, serves to frame political power as transient and contingent. The tale uses that aesthetic not to resign readers to fate, but to insist on the contingency of practical foundations. The splendor of a court procession, the glitter of a new rank, the taste of victory on a field, these sensory facts do not secure tenure. By embedding impermanence into its rhetoric, the Heike teaches a structural lesson. Power that rests primarily on display or on temporary spoils cannot build institutions capable of withstanding coordinated opposition. The narrative thus translates philosophical reflections on emptiness into a diagnosis of political fragility. Impermanence makes hubris visible and makes institutional gaps lethal. Internal fracturing within clans forms another key pressure because loyalty in this system rests both on kinship and on immediate advantage. The Heike portrays clans as networks of relatives, vassals, and retinue whose bonds tighten under success and fray under pressure. That duality means that a clan's coherence depends as much on the distribution of opportunities within it as on shared identity. When wealth and appointments flow to some branches and not to others, resentments develop into open rupture. The tale watches the slow breakdown of such loyalties by embedding episodes where a clan's member defects or where subordinate houses withhold assistance in a moment of crisis. Because the polity lacks impartial mechanisms for adjudicating internal claims, these fractures become political levers. A rival can exploit kinship grievances to recruit allies, thereby transforming private family disputes into public, destabilizing coalitions. The Heike thus shows that a polity whose social fabric depends on dynastic favor is always vulnerable to the centrifugal logic of internal competition. Community structure compounds these dynamics because urban elites in the capital and the semi-autonomous provinces experience governance according to different logics. Kyoto's court culture still practices ceremony, patronage, and aesthetic rivalry. It values rank, poetry, and ritual as sources of prestige. Out in the provinces, power answers to grain, roads, manpower, and the capacity to blunt or enable violence. The Heike moves between these settings in order to show how policies that make sense in one sphere fail in the other. A court decree crafted by men who prize precedence will not restrain a provincial lord who must secure harvests and fend off banditry. And a military solution forged in the provinces looks like brute overreach when staged before temple bells. That mismatch produces miscommunication and miscalculation. The capital assumes that ritual condemnation suffices, while provincial actors assume the court will not attempt to project force across territory it does not control. The tale composes scenes where these assumptions collide, making visible how spatial disjunctions create political shock. As these pressures compound, the state loses the capacity to harmonize its competing centers. The Heike consistently frames decline as the result of multiple, overlapping failures rather than as the outcome of a single betrayal. A court that cannot collect taxes cannot pay for loyalty. A family that binds its legitimacy to marriage and patronage cannot withstand internal jealousies. Provinces that gain autonomy by force cannot be reintegrated by ritual alone. Temples that hold land and troops cannot be simply persuaded to stand down. Each failure increases the costs of repair. The tale sketches how incremental breakdowns accumulate. A fiscal hemorrhage becomes a recruitment crisis, which becomes a chain of defections, which becomes open conflict. Because the institutions that might mediate these escalations have hollowed out, the system tends toward fragmentation rather than toward reconstitution. And the Heike's rhetoric of impermanence thereby acquires a practical edge. The end of an era does not need a single cataclysm when structural contradictions have already corroded cohesion from within. Embedded in this structural reading is a clear causal logic that explains why a powerful house's fall is not merely possible, but, in the Heike's terms, probable. When military success is converted into court office without parallel institutional reform, the result is an overconcentration of patronage, an impoverishment of formal fiscal mechanisms, and a proliferation of enemies whose only recourse is coalition. A dominant house thus creates the exact configuration that makes coordinated opposition feasible. Many actors share a common grievance and have nearby means of redress, while the central apparatus lacks an impartial mechanism to recalibrate claims. The tale frames this as the tragic arithmetic of power. The strengths that enable assent, decisive action, control of estates, marital ties to the center, also produce vulnerabilities because they bypass impersonal institutions that could stabilize succession, allocate rents fairly, and mediate disputes. The Heike therefore treats the fall of the dominant house not as a moral inevitability, but as a structural consequence of a system unbalanced by the confluence of personal patronage and declining central capacity. Reading the Heike closely, one discerns repeated moments where the text uses concrete episodes to render this logic visible, rather than just asserting it. When the tale describes a household that arranges marriages to secure access to the throne, it doesn't simply mourn ambition. It shows how those marriages become public property, how each party to the alliance expects returns, and how disappointment makes the alliance a source of grievance. When the narrative recounts a provincial steward asserting control over a road, it shows how that steward, once entrenched, functions as a sovereign in miniature, collecting tolls, passing sentence, and raising men, and how the center's inability to dislodge him reveals its impotence. When the story lingers on a temple that fields armed monks, it shows how sacramental authority can become territorial authority in practice. Each episode in the Heike thus serves as a microscopic argument about the larger structure. The same moves that shore up immediate control also create openings for rivals and for systemic collapse when those moves take place without institutional balance. That microscopic logic culminates in an image the tale returns to. Power that shines intensely in a short span tends to cast long shadows of resentment. The Heike's language of transience and of borrowed light. The court's prestige is borrowed from ritual. The military's force is borrowed from supporters. The temple's authority is borrowed from faith. Makes clear that when all these borrowings concentrate in one house, the lone calls come due in the form of opposing coalitions, fiscal shortages, and the erosion of loyalty. The narrative treats hubris not simply as moral failing, but as a strategic miscalculation. By collapsing distance between the sacred center and the sword-bearing household, the dominant house removes the buffer that keeps rivals apart and makes every slight and every favoritism legitimate cause for redress by force. The Heike thus converts aesthetic judgments into structural diagnosis. The collapse is not an accident, but the endpoint of a set of pressures set into motion by the very instruments of rise. Because these dynamics operate across social strata, the silent mass of peasantry functions as the invisible foundation that both supports and undermines power. The tale rarely gives peasants a voice, yet it constantly returns to the grain they tend and the taxes they pay as the material substrate of all claims. When extraction intensifies to supply a war economy, peasants lose the capacity to reproduce their subsistence, which in turn reduces the pool of men available for levies and increases the likelihood of local unrest. Monasteries and warrior houses that rely on the peasant base thus face a perverse limit. Short-term extraction can provision immediate military needs, but sustained predation erodes the base itself. The Heike inscribes this limit into its scenes of provinces depopulated by levies and fields abandoned, making clear that the fiscal and social underpinnings of power are not inexhaustible, and that their exhaustion turns the political center into a bank run waiting to happen. All of these threads weave toward fragmentation as the most probable structural outcome. The tale conveys fragmentation not as a mere scatter of actors, but as a rearrangement of sovereignty into multiple, competing centers: court, temple, provincial house, militant monastery, each with a claim to legitimacy, and each with means to enforce it locally. Because the mechanism for arbitration, a central, adequately resourced bureaucracy, has been hollowed by estate autonomy and by the substitution of personal military ties, there is no reliable center to adjudicate disputes. The Heike presents this multiplicity as the condition into which an empire slowly slides. When every center feels the need to defend its slice, cooperation becomes unstable, and conflict becomes the default mechanism of correction. The tale therefore represents collapse as a systemic realignment rather than as the demise of a single villain, showing that the fall of any powerful house is the logical continuation of an ordered sequence of institutional degradations. If one follows the Heike's argument step by step, the fall of the dominant house looks less like an unpredictable reversal than like the endpoint of a buildup of pressures whose anatomy the tale carefully maps. A consolidated house draws resources and honors to itself, creating concentrated grievance. It depends on fragile patronage ties that unravel under stress. It undermines the impartial mechanisms that might regulate succession and rent distribution. It accelerates a war economy that weakens the peasant foundation, and it provokes temples and provinces to act in self-defense. The narrative thus makes the fall coherent and legible. It is the structural solution to a dilemma the polity could not otherwise solve. The Heike's recurring refrain about impermanence becomes not a fatalism, but a recognition that systems composed of contradictory logics, sacred ritual and armed enforcement, centralized ritual and decentralized extraction, personal loyalty and institutional continuity, will choose a new equilibrium through conflict rather than through polite administrative reform. That is the shape of instability the Heike offers. A world where ceremonial order persists in posture, while practical governance fractures into competing claims, where military success buys court honors without producing stable institutions, where economic extraction fuels warfare rather than civil repair, where family ties both bind and split, and where temples and provinces act as parallel sovereignties. The tale transforms moral reflection into institutional critique, showing that the conditions for collapse sit inside the mechanisms that once promised cohesion. As a result, the text reads less like a chronicle of bad actors and more like a careful account of a system whose internal pressures make the downfall of a dominant house almost inevitable once certain thresholds of concentration, resentment, and fiscal exhaustion are crossed. The Heike closes no moral ledger. It leaves the future open in the same way the bells leave sound, fading into silence. But that very openness contains an analytical insistence. Political forms survive only if their material and social bases remain balanced. And when legitimacy rests simultaneously on ceremony and on coercion without institutional intermediaries, it breeds the conditions of its own undoing. The tale compels listeners to hear the structural echoes in its episodes, to see marriages and appointments not as incidental color, but as gears in a machine that can jam, and to recognize that the spectacle of a court procession or the glitter of armor conceal the practical logistics that actually sustain rule. The Heike's narrative voice thus teaches an enduring lesson about power. Consolidation without institutionalization stores up risk, and the louder a house proclaims its immunity to fate, the more it calls the attention of a system structured precisely to rebalance itself when the center overreaches. That's all for today on Libeth. If you want to follow the whole journey, subscribe, a new book every week.